Learning to write Chinese characters by hand takes a lot of time, but in today's digital society, is handwriting even necessary? Let's explore the role of handwriting when learning Chinese as a second language and discuss what a curriculum that caters to all students might look like. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to share a reflective essay that I've written for an upcoming publication called Transforming Hanzi Pedagogy in the Digital Age. In this book, which will be published by Routledge, researchers and educators present a rationale for shifting focus from handwriting to e-writing, so that would be typing for example, in Chinese pedagogy for second language learners. For more information about the book, including how to pre-order it, please check the information and the links in the show notes. With permission from the publisher, I've also published my contribution to the book in its entirety on Hacking Chinese, and I will read it to you now. The title is Chinese Character Learning for All Students, written by me, Ole Linge. The purpose of language is communication. We learn languages to be able to express ourselves, to understand others, and to exchange ideas, even though the specific goals may vary from person to person. Language learning also has an important function in society, as it enables people to participate in new social, cultural, and professional contexts, which leads to deeper cross-cultural understanding. In this light, it is surprising that the teaching of Chinese as a second language has focused on communicative ability to a lesser extent than many other languages. When I started learning Chinese in 2007 here in Sweden, my home country, we were given a chapter's worth of vocabulary to memorize each week, including listening, speaking, reading, and writing by hand from memory. At first glance, this looks like a balanced approach, but it is not. While the outcome is balanced in the sense that students can write what they can say and understand both written and spoken Chinese, this approach is not balanced when it comes to how students spend their time, because in order to be able to write everything by hand, from memory, students must put more effort into that than all other skills combined. Learning Chinese was, in a practical sense, largely about learning to write characters. The problem here is that knowing how to write Chinese characters by hand is not required to communicate in a modern digital world. Even when living in a Chinese-speaking environment, handwriting is only a must in a small set of specific situations, such as filling out forms or writing simple messages. In these cases, we can rely on digital dictionaries to look up characters we don't know how to write, much like native speakers do when they forget how to write a character. It goes without saying that we still need to be able to read characters, but written communication is almost exclusively digital these days, which only requires us to know how a word is pronounced and what it looks like. Recognizing the correct character in a list is significantly easier than writing it by hand. Still, for most students learning Chinese in classrooms, the curricula they are taught cause learning Chinese to remain largely about learning to write characters by hand. The main motivation for learning this is often to pass exams or to advance to the next institutional level. As a student, I spent countless hours preparing for different tests, big and small, usually in the form of tingxie or dictation. Almost all the exams I sat for were written exams where handwriting was required. The peak for me was in grad school, where I studied teaching Chinese as a second language alongside native speakers in Taiwan, and had 3-hour exams about language pedagogy and Chinese linguistics written by hand. This required good knowledge of many thousands of characters. What strikes me in hindsight is that in the 15 years I've been learning and using Chinese, I've never been required to write Chinese by hand outside a classroom without having access to a dictionary. Not a single time. This does not necessarily mean that writing by hand is not useful, but it does mean that if we are serious when we say that the purpose of language is to communicate, we need to think hard about the role of handwriting in modern written communication. I've kept a detailed record of my character learning and knew almost 6,000 characters in grad school, even though I have since abandoned the rarest 1,000 characters or so. While I have not recorded exactly how much time I've spent on characters since 2007, I can estimate it based on statistics from apps that I've used, such as Scritter, and language logs that I've kept. A conservative estimate is 2,500 hours, which only includes vocabulary-specific activities, so not reading texts in Chinese, for example. Learning to write by hand certainly takes up most of that time, but it's hard to be precise, so let's say that 1,500 hours were spent on handwriting specifically. That is about twice as much time as I spent learning French in secondary school, a language I became relatively proficient in. If I had cut down on writing by hand in Chinese, I could probably have learned German and Spanish in the time I saved. Or I could have made progress in other areas of learning Chinese much faster. This is the crux of the matter. If we require students to learn to handwrite everything they learn how to say, they will spend most of their time on handwriting. While we might want to keep our students for ourselves and not have them learn French, Spanish, or German, we certainly want them to progress faster in Chinese. By shifting the focus from handwriting to literacy and digital written communication, students would become both more proficient and more confident. This has obvious benefits for the students themselves, but also for Chinese as an educational subject. Is the solution then to remove handwriting from the curriculum? No, I don't think so, and there are two main reasons for this. First, writing a character by hand can allow for deeper processing than simply selecting the same character from a list of candidates, provided that attention is directed to the composition and logic behind the characters. Still, there is a case to be made that writing by hand is an effective, albeit inefficient, way of committing characters to memory, even if your goal is only to be able to read and type. However, as discussed earlier, the effort required needs to be taken into account, so learning to write a core set of characters and functional components by hand should be enough. This is also the approach taken in the new standard for the HSK, a Chinese proficiency test, that took effect in July 2021. Second, many students enjoy writing characters, and some even start learning Chinese because they are attracted to the beautiful script. I was such a student, which is why I don't regret spending so much time on characters over the years. Chinese characters are not merely for communication, they are also an integral part of the culture. Still, it seems odd to single out Chinese as a language where it's normal to focus so much on writing to the detriment of the other skills, even if some students enjoy writing characters. I maintain that language is for communication and that Chinese as an additional language needs to be aligned with that. Those who wish to master writing by hand are free to do so, but it should not be something we force all students to do. In recent years, I've been involved in the national curriculum design for Chinese taught in Swedish lower and upper secondary schools, so I've had the opportunity to think thoroughly about these matters and how they can be implemented in a national curriculum. In my opinion, two principles underpin character learning for all students: sequencing and scope. First, the spoken language should precede the written language. In the Swedish curriculum, students are expected to progress roughly twice as fast in spoken Chinese as in written Chinese. This means that teachers are free to put more emphasis on the spoken language and introduce characters gradually at a slower pace. Second, when it comes to the written language, students are only required to write by hand to a certain extent, meaning that their full ability in written production and interaction is assessed with access to digital tools. Only a subset of characters and words need to be mastered by hand. To summarize, as long as we use an approach for teaching Chinese that forces all students to spend most of their time writing characters by hand, only those who truly love doing so or have the self-discipline to force themselves to do it will succeed. For the rest, Chinese will appear to be an impossibly difficult and tedious subject. We know that that's not the case, and that learning Chinese is not only possible, but can also be fun and enriching. By setting realistic requirements based on communicative needs and limiting the amount of characters students need to write by hand, we allow more students to reach further with benefits for them, their teachers, and for society as a whole. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.